The biggest mistake entitled people make is believing that confidence can replace ownership, and the woman smiling at me from the middle of my own ranch was about to learn exactly why that never ends well. My name is Caleb Dawson, and my family has raised cattle on this land outside Waco, Texas, for 3 generations. Every fence post, every oak tree, every acre of pasture carries a story that started long before I was born. That's why it felt almost unreal when I turned my pickup onto the gravel entrance just after 10 that Saturday morning and found more than 200 guests dressed in expensive suits and elegant dresses applauding as a bride walked down a flower-covered aisle built right across my grazing field. White folding chairs stretched farther than I could count. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary steel frames. A string quartet played beneath a massive white tent. A drone hovered overhead, filming every perfect moment from the sky. The smell of fresh roses drifted through the warm Texas air, mixing with something else that nobody except me seemed to notice yet. Standing near the front row, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a clipboard like she owned the entire county, was Karen Mitchell. The moment she spotted my truck rolling toward the ceremony, she folded her arms and gave me a smile that said she believed I was the one interrupting her special event. A security guard actually stepped toward my vehicle before I had even turned off the engine. I climbed out slowly, closed the door, adjusted my hat, and looked across the pasture that my grandfather had cleared by hand nearly 70 years earlier. Someone had driven heavy equipment across my grass. Wooden platforms had been bolted together over the field where my cattle normally grazed. Decorative signs pointed guests toward a temporary parking area filled with luxury SUVs parked exactly where my irrigation lines ran beneath the surface. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody looked guilty. They laughed, took pictures, and complimented the beautiful countryside as if it had magically appeared for their entertainment. Karen walked toward me with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. She smiled politely enough for everyone watching to believe she was being reasonable and said, "Sir, we're in the middle of a wedding. I'd appreciate it if you waited until we're finished." For a second, I honestly wondered if she believed those words. Then I noticed something even more interesting. Every warning sign I had posted the evening before was gone. Every single one. My eyes followed the edges of the property where bright orange notices should have been standing every 100 feet. Instead, there were only fresh holes in the soil where someone had pulled them out to make the scenery look prettier for photographs. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't take a single step toward the ceremony. I simply checked the time on my watch, looked back across the field, and realized the Texas sun was almost exactly where I had been waiting for it to be. Karen thought she had won before the story had even started. What she didn't know was that everything happening around her was unfolding exactly on schedule. I left the truck exactly where it was and took another slow look across the pasture before saying a single word. People who have never worked the land see open space. Farmers see calendars, routines, and responsibilities. Every acre on my ranch followed a schedule that had been refined over decades, and nothing happened by accident. My grandfather used to tell me that the land rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. My father repeated those same words almost every weekend while teaching me how to repair fences, rotate grazing fields, and read the weather without looking at a forecast. By the time I was 12 years old, I could tell whether rain would arrive within a day simply by watching the clouds roll over the oak trees on the western ridge. By 16, I knew every irrigation valve, every cattle path, and every property marker on our ranch. When my father passed away, I inherited more than 600 acres and an even greater responsibility. I promised myself that no matter how difficult ranching became, I would protect what my family had built with honest work instead of selling it for easy money. That promise became even more important after developers started buying neighboring properties. Luxury subdivisions replaced old hay fields. Boutique wineries appeared where cotton once grew. Every few months, another investor called, offering figures that sounded tempting to people who had never watched a sunrise from the seat of a tractor. I always gave the same answer. The ranch was not for sale. Apparently, Karen Mitchell did not believe that answer applied to her. Over the previous year, I had noticed more unfamiliar vehicles slowing down along the county road. Some drivers climbed out just to take pictures of the old red barn. Others flew drones over the fields without asking permission. A few even walked through unlocked gates, assuming nobody would mind because they only planned to stay for a minute. Each time, I politely explained that private property was still private property, even if it looked beautiful in photographs. Most people apologized and left. Karen was different. About 2 months earlier, she had stopped by in a polished luxury sport utility vehicle wearing that same confident smile. She introduced herself as a real estate professional representing clients interested in unique event venues. Before I could finish telling her the ranch was an active cattle operation, she had already begun describing wedding packages, weekend retreats, and social media campaigns that would supposedly make us both wealthy. I thanked her for the offer and told her, as clearly as I could, that Dawson Ranch would never become a commercial event venue. She smiled politely, handed me her business card, and said I would eventually change my mind because everyone had a price. I dropped that card into the glove compartment of my truck and never thought about it again. Standing there that Saturday morning, watching strangers celebrate on my pasture, I realized she had not accepted my answer at all. She had simply decided that my refusal was an obstacle she could ignore. She believed appearances mattered more than ownership, and judging by the cheerful crowd surrounding her, nearly everyone else believed it too. They saw elegant decorations, perfect weather, and rolling green fields. I saw tire tracks, across protected grass, temporary flooring covering grazing land, and a woman who had mistaken silence for surrender. She still had no idea that every decision she had made since sunrise had quietly moved her one step closer to a lesson neither money nor confidence could prevent. As I stood there watching guests smile for photographs, pieces of a much larger puzzle finally started fitting together. This wedding had not been planned overnight. It had taken weeks of preparation, dozens of phone calls, deliveries, contracts, and advertising. That meant Karen had never intended to ask for permission because asking would have given me the chance to say no again. She had built her entire plan around the assumption that appearances would outweigh facts long enough for her to get what she wanted. Later, I would learn just how far that assumption had gone. One of my neighbors eventually told me he had seen photographers visiting the ranch several times during the previous month, always staying outside the fence but taking hundreds of pictures with long camera lenses. At the time, everyone assumed they were simply tourists. They were not. They were gathering promotional material. Karen had already started advertising what she called an exclusive luxury countryside experience for high-end weddings and private events. The photographs featured my red barn, my oak trees, my rolling pasture, and even the small pond my father had dug years ago. She never mentioned Dawson Ranch by name. Instead, she described it as an undiscovered private venue available for select celebrations. Looking around that Saturday morning, I noticed banners displaying the logo of her real estate company near the reception tent. A videographer was interviewing guests while another camera operator filmed wide shots of the ceremony from every possible angle. This was never just about one wedding. It was a commercial advertisement disguised as a celebration. If everything went according to Karen's plan, those polished videos would convince future clients that she controlled this property, opening the door for more events before anyone realized the truth. Suddenly, the expensive decorations made perfect sense. The elegant tables, the carefully arranged floral displays, the custom wooden signs, and even the branded gift bags were not only for the bride and groom. They were investments in Karen's next business venture. Every smiling guest became part of her marketing campaign without even knowing it. I slowly turned toward the old barn and noticed several temporary signs pointing visitors toward a future event office that did not exist. My family name had been replaced with decorative lettering chosen to match the wedding theme. Seeing that hurt far more than the tire tracks in the grass. It felt like decades of family history had been quietly erased with a few pieces of painted plywood. Karen caught me looking in that direction and smiled again, clearly believing she had already won. She walked closer and spoke softly enough that the nearby guests could not hear. She said this event would show everyone the true potential of my land and suggested that after seeing how successful it was, I would probably thank her. I simply looked at her for a moment before shifting my attention toward the bright blue Texas sky. The morning sun continued climbing exactly as expected. A gentle breeze rolled across the pasture, carrying the familiar scent of freshly worked farmland that I had known my entire life, but that everyone else still ignored. Karen mistook my silence for defeat because she believed confidence could rewrite reality. She had no idea that the ranch operated according to rules far older than either of us. And every passing minute brought those rules one step closer to introducing themselves to every single person attending her carefully planned event. Karen clearly expected me to lose my patience, and when I did not, she decided to raise the stakes herself. She turned away from me, clapped her hands once, and motioned for the wedding planner to come over. Within seconds, a man wearing a headset hurried across the grass carrying a thick event binder. Karen spoke loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. She explained that I was simply a local rancher who had misunderstood the situation and assured everyone that all necessary arrangements had already been made. The planner immediately opened the binder and pulled out several printed contracts, permits for temporary structures, catering agreements, and vendor schedules. He flipped through the pages with complete confidence, stopping at a site map that matched the layout surrounding us. Every tent, every table, every parking area had been carefully measured and labeled. It looked professional enough that anyone standing nearby would naturally assume everything had been approved. Then Karen looked directly at me and asked if I had any paperwork proving they were not supposed to be there. I almost smiled. She believed paperwork only mattered when it supported her version of the story. Before I could answer, one of the security guards quietly called the county sheriff's office, explaining that a property dispute was interrupting a private event. About 20 minutes later, a deputy drove through the open gate and parked beside my truck. He stepped out calmly, greeted both of us, and asked what was happening. Karen answered before I could speak. She explained that the event had been booked months in advance through a venue representative and suggested that I had appeared unexpectedly demanding everyone leave. She sounded calm, organized, and completely believable. The deputy turned toward me and politely asked for my side of the story. I explained that I was the owner of Dawson Ranch and that nobody had permission to organize a commercial event anywhere on my property. He listened carefully, then looked back at the planner, who immediately handed him copies of the event documents. The deputy studied the paperwork for several moments before returning it. Finally, he sighed and explained that ownership disputes involving contracts and access rights were civil matters unless there was an immediate public safety concern. He encouraged everyone to remain calm while the issue was resolved through the proper legal process. Karen thanked him with a satisfied smile that she made no effort to hide. Several guests relaxed, believing the deputy's presence had settled everything. The musicians resumed playing. The photographer continued arranging family portraits beneath the old oak trees. Conversations returned to laughter almost as quickly as they had stopped. Karen gave me one final look that practically invited me to make a scene in front of 200 witnesses. Instead, I reached into my pocket, took out my phone, and quietly sent a message to my attorney. Then I opened another application connected to every security camera installed across the ranch. Green status indicators appeared one after another across the screen, confirming every camera was recording exactly as it should. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and checked my watch once again. The deputy noticed how calm I remained and glanced toward the bright sky before looking back at me with quiet curiosity. I simply nodded politely and stepped away from the ceremony without another word. Karen interpreted my silence as surrender. The truth was much simpler. There are moments when the smartest move is not to stop people from making a mistake. Sometimes all you have to do is let them continue believing they are completely in control until the consequences arrive exactly on schedule. I walked away from the ceremony without looking back, not because I was giving up, but because everything I needed had already been set in motion long before the first guest arrived. My attorney answered on the second ring. I briefly explained that unauthorized commercial activity was taking place on my property, that the county deputy had documented the initial contact, and that every security camera on the ranch was recording. He told me exactly what I expected to hear. Stay calm. Do not interfere with the event. Preserve every piece of evidence. Let the facts speak for themselves. I thanked him, ended the call, and opened the ranch management application on my phone. Every camera icon glowed green. The entrance gate, the equipment barn, the north pasture, the pond, and the old oak grove were all recording in high definition. Timestamps appeared in the corner of every live feed. Delivery trucks arriving before sunrise. Vendors unloading equipment. Workers removing fencing panels. Guests walking through gates marked private property. Everything was there. No arguments. No opinions. Just facts. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and slowly made my way toward the equipment shed on the opposite side of the pasture. From there I could still hear the wedding vows carried by the breeze, but I was far enough away that nobody paid attention to me anymore. That was exactly where I wanted to be. Ranch work had taught me that timing often mattered more than effort. You could not rush rain. You could not hurry cattle. You could not force crops to grow before they were ready. Nature always followed its own schedule, and experienced ranchers learned to work with it instead of against it. I looked across the pasture where sunlight continued spreading over the freshly treated grass. The temperature had climbed steadily since morning. The forecast predicted it would reach 92 degrees before early afternoon, with almost no cloud cover. I had checked that forecast 3 different times the previous evening because weather determined nearly every decision we made on the ranch. Around me, everything appeared completely ordinary. Birds moved between fence posts. A light breeze crossed the field from the southwest. The oak leaves rustled softly above the parked vehicles. Guests laughed during the reception as servers carried lunch toward the tent. Karen walked confidently between tables, shaking hands, posing for photographs, and congratulating herself on what she believed would become her greatest professional success. Every few minutes she glanced in my direction, almost disappointed that I was no longer trying to stop her. She expected confrontation because confrontation would have allowed her to portray herself as the reasonable one. Instead, she had nothing to react to except my silence. That silence made her even more confident. I noticed members of the wedding staff adjusting decorations near the edge of the pasture where several bright orange warning posts still remained. The signs themselves were gone, but the empty metal stakes were impossible to miss once you knew where to look. Someone had deliberately removed every notice while leaving the posts behind. I quietly took several photographs from where I stood, making sure the missing signs and remaining stakes appeared together in the same frame. Those pictures would matter later. Then I checked my watch once again. According to the clock, the sun, and the weather, the ranch was almost ready to remind everyone that no amount of planning could ever rewrite the natural rhythm of working land. Around noon, the ranch began doing exactly what it had always done, completely indifferent to expensive decorations or carefully planned schedules. The sun climbed higher over central Texas, warming the pasture inch by inch until the morning dew disappeared from the grass. I had seen this same transition thousands of times throughout my life, but for everyone attending the reception, it was simply another beautiful afternoon. They had no reason to notice the difference because they did not know what had happened on this field less than 24 hours earlier. The previous afternoon had been devoted to routine seasonal maintenance, something every responsible rancher in our county performs several times a year. I had spread an organic fertilizer across the grazing pasture to improve soil health before the next cattle rotation. It was completely legal, carefully documented, and applied according to the manufacturer's instructions and county agricultural recommendations. After finishing the work, I had logged the treatment in my ranch records, photographed the completed application, and placed bright orange warning signs around the affected sections of the property advising visitors to stay clear while the treatment settled into the soil. Those signs were not optional decorations. They existed to inform anyone entering the area that normal agricultural operations had recently taken place. This was a working ranch, not a public park. Every step followed standard practice because protecting both the land and visitors mattered to me. Standing near the fence now, I could still remember placing the final warning sign beside the main entrance before driving back to the house the previous evening. Every one of those signs had been standing straight when I went to bed. By sunrise, they had disappeared. The security recordings had already shown me exactly why. Members of the event setup crew had pulled them from the ground shortly after arriving because they believed the bright orange panels would ruin the elegant appearance of the ceremony. Nobody had called to ask why the signs were there. Nobody had contacted the county agricultural office. Nobody had attempted to reach me. They simply decided that appearance mattered more than information. As the temperature continued rising, a familiar earthy scent slowly became more noticeable across the pasture. To me, it smelled like another ordinary day of ranch work, something I had experienced since childhood. To people wearing formal clothes who expected nothing but fresh flowers and perfume, it was something entirely different. I noticed a few guests quietly looking around as though trying to identify where the unexpected smell was coming from. Some laughed it off. Others moved their chairs a little farther beneath the reception tent. Karen remained completely occupied greeting vendors and thanking guests for attending. Never realizing that the ranch itself had begun revealing the truth she had worked so hard to hide. I checked my watch again and smiled to myself. Nothing unusual was happening. There were no surprises, no tricks, and no dramatic confrontation. There was only a working pasture following the same natural rhythm it had followed for decades. The only difference was that this time, hundreds of people had chosen to build a luxury celebration directly on top of it after removing the very warnings that could have helped them make a different decision, and every passing minute made that choice a little harder to ignore. The change did not happen all at once. It arrived so gradually that most people did not realize anything was different until they looked around and noticed everyone else reacting first. The afternoon sun settled directly over the pasture, warming the freshly treated ground exactly as the weather forecast had predicted. The light breeze that had drifted harmlessly across the ranch all morning became more consistent, carrying the rich, earthy scent of the recently fertilized field through the reception area. To me, it smelled exactly like another successful season of ranch work. To guests expecting only fresh flowers and polished table settings, it was unexpected. One table quietly asked the catering staff if something nearby had been disturbed. Another group laughed and blamed the neighboring cattle pastures, assuming that was all they were noticing. Karen overheard the comments and immediately assured everyone that country weddings always came with authentic ranch atmosphere. Her confidence earned a few smiles, but the conversations did not stop. Meanwhile, the ground itself began reminding everyone that this was still an active pasture rather than a manicured event venue. Areas that had looked perfectly firm during the cool morning softened slightly beneath hundreds of footsteps as the day grew warmer. High heels began pressing deeper into the grass, forcing several guests to remove their shoes before walking toward the dance floor. A photographer asked the bridal party to move closer to the barn, then paused when one of his equipment carts rolled unevenly across the field instead of gliding smoothly. The wedding planner blamed the uneven terrain and hurried staff members over with wooden boards to stabilize a few areas. Every solution created another small problem somewhere else. I remained beneath the old oak tree watching quietly, saying nothing. My phone vibrated with another message from my attorney asking whether anyone had attempted to remove me from my own property. I replied that nobody had, and that the cameras were still recording everything. He answered with only 4 words. Keep documenting. Stay patient. That was exactly what I intended to do. Across the reception, I noticed 2 members of the setup crew walking behind the catering trailers. Moments later, they stopped abruptly. One of them bent down and pulled several bright orange signs from behind stacked supply containers. Even from a distance, I recognized them immediately. They exchanged confused looks before carrying the signs toward Karen. She accepted them with visible frustration, glanced around to make sure guests were not paying attention, and quietly instructed someone to place them back out of sight. She never read the warnings printed across the front. She never asked why they had been installed. She simply wanted them hidden again because they did not match the elegant image she had spent months creating. That single decision told me everything I needed to know. It was no longer an honest misunderstanding. It was a deliberate choice to ignore information that conflicted with the story she wanted everyone to believe. Around us, more guests slowly drifted toward the shaded edges of the property where the breeze felt cooler. Conversations shifted away from decorations and toward the unusual smell lingering across the field. Vendors began whispering among themselves while checking their shoes and rolling equipment. Karen continued smiling for photographs, determined to protect the perfect image she had built, never realizing that every passing minute transformed her carefully staged celebration into the strongest possible evidence that appearances could never outrun reality. The reception finally reached the point where even the most optimistic guests could no longer pretend everything felt normal. Conversations became shorter as more people wandered away from the center of the pasture searching for cleaner air and firmer ground. The band continued playing, but fewer guests remained near the dance floor. Several vendors quietly discussed moving equipment closer to the gravel driveway because rolling carts across the softened grass had become increasingly difficult. The wedding planner wiped sweat from his forehead while checking his schedule for the 3rd time in less than 10 minutes. Everything that had looked effortless that morning now required constant adjustments. Karen refused to accept what was unfolding in front of her. Instead of asking why the conditions had changed, she became determined to protect the image she had promised everyone. She instructed photographers to crop tighter shots that avoided the crowded edges of the pasture. She asked the videographer to focus on smiling faces instead of wide landscape views. Every decision centered on appearances rather than reality. That was when my phone rang again. It was my attorney. He calmly informed me that he had already reviewed the security footage I uploaded along with my ranch maintenance records, weather log, application receipts, and the digital time stamps from the previous afternoon. Everything matched perfectly. The fertilizer application had been completed according to agricultural guidelines. The warning signs had been installed before sunset. The camera recordings clearly showed members of the event crew removing every one of them before guests arrived. He told me not to confront anyone because the documentation already spoke louder than any argument ever could. Just as we ended the call, another vehicle pulled into the entrance. It belonged to an insurance representative hired by one of the event vendors after receiving complaints about the changing conditions. The representative walked through the reception, looked across the pasture, then stopped beside one of the empty metal posts where a warning sign had originally stood. He bent down, examined the disturbed soil around the post, and asked the planner where the sign had gone. Nobody answered immediately. Several workers exchanged nervous looks before one quietly admitted that the signs had been removed because they looked unattractive in the wedding photographs. The representative asked whether anyone had documented that decision. Silence followed. Karen stepped forward and insisted the signs were unnecessary because the field appeared perfectly safe when everyone arrived. The representative simply nodded without agreeing. A few minutes later, two workers retrieved the bright orange signs from behind the parked box truck where Karen had ordered them hidden. They leaned them against the trailer while everyone nearby read the large black lettering for the very first time. Suddenly, the conversations changed. Guests who had been confused only moments earlier now understood exactly why the pasture smelled different and why the ground felt unlike a landscaped event venue. Nobody panicked. Nobody shouted. They simply realized they had never been given the information they should have received before stepping onto an active working ranch. Karen's confident smile slowly disappeared as more vendors gathered around the recovered signs. Comparing the printed warnings with the camera time stamps my attorney had already preserved. She had spent months creating the perfect story for future clients. But in less than 20 minutes, a handful of ordinary facts had quietly dismantled every illusion she had built. Standing beneath the old oak tree, I watched the afternoon unfold exactly as my grandfather always said it would. The truth did not need perfect timing, dramatic speeches, or raised voices. It only needed enough time for every missing piece to return to exactly where it belonged. The reception ended far more quietly than it had begun. There was no dramatic announcement, no public argument, and no scene that anyone would have described as unforgettable in the moment. Instead, reality slowly replaced assumption. Guests thanked the bride and groom, gathered their belongings, and left the ranch with a better understanding of what had actually happened. Most of them realized they had never been intentionally placed in danger. They had simply attended an event that should never have been held on an active agricultural pasture without the property owner's permission or the warning signs that had originally been placed for everyone's benefit. Vendors packed their equipment with noticeably less conversation than earlier in the day. Several stopped to apologize to me personally after learning I was the actual owner of Dawson Ranch. They admitted they had believed Karen when she presented herself as the person in charge of the property. I accepted every apology because none of them had removed the signs or claimed ownership of land that did not belong to them. As the last vehicles disappeared down the gravel road, the ranch finally became quiet again. The familiar sounds returned almost immediately. The wind moved gently through the oak trees. Cattle grazed peacefully beyond the fenced pasture. The earthy scent that had caused so much confusion that afternoon simply blended back into the ordinary rhythm of ranch life, where it belonged. 2 weeks later, my attorney called with the update I had been expecting. The insurance representative had completed his report using the security footage, maintenance records, weather logs, application receipts, Photographs and witness statements gathered from vendors who admitted the warning signs had been removed before guests arrived. The findings were remarkably straightforward. The agricultural work itself had been lawful, properly documented, and completed according to standard practice. Responsibility rested with the unauthorized event organizers who entered private property, ignored visible boundaries, removed posted warnings, and conducted a commercial gathering without permission from the landowner. Shortly afterward, Karen's promotional listings advertising Dawson Ranch as an exclusive wedding destination quietly disappeared from every website where she had posted them. Several business partners publicly distanced themselves from her company after reviewing the documentation. Vendors who had once planned to recommend her services chose not to work with her again because trust had become impossible to rebuild once the facts were established. As for Dawson Ranch, nothing really changed. I replaced every warning sign with new ones, repaired the areas where heavy traffic had worn the pasture, and returned to the same routine my family had followed for 3 generations. The fields recovered exactly as they always had. The cattle returned to grazing. Another season arrived, bringing new work instead of new drama. Every now and then, someone in town asks whether the story they heard about the wedding was true. I simply smile and tell them the ranch never sought revenge against anyone. It only continued doing what a working ranch has always done. The truth was what made the difference. Every camera recording, every maintenance log, every photograph, every receipt, every timestamp, and every missing warning sign fit together like pieces of the same puzzle until there was no room left for excuses. My grandfather used to tell me that land remembers how people treat it, but records remember even more. Standing on the porch of the farmhouse as the sun disappeared behind the pastures that evening, I realized he had been right. Justice had not arrived with anger or revenge. It arrived with patience, preparation, and undeniable facts, because on a ranch built by honest work, the truth never needed anyone to shout for it to be heard.